Tetris is a game that will be remembered in history. Nearly 40 years after its release, new records are still being set, and the Tetris community is larger than ever. If you've watched me for a while, you may know that I already made Tetris with Redstone a long time ago, but it absolutely sucked. It didn't have rotation, at least not while falling, and there was no color. So this is the story of how I upgraded this monstrosity and made Redstone Tetris the right way. I hope you enjoy. The basic idea of Tetris is pretty simple. There are 7 pieces, or tetrominoes, and the game is played on a 10x20 board. At the start, a random piece starts falling. The player can move it left or right, or they can rotate it. Once it can't fall anymore, it gets locked into place, and a new random piece starts falling. This repeats itself over and over again. When pieces get locked in, if any horizontal lines become completely full, they get cleared, and the stuff above them shifts down. The more lines you clear, the more points you get. If your tower gets too high and a new piece can't spawn, you lose. And most versions of Tetris also have a level system where the pieces get faster and faster for every new level. So that's the basic idea, but when it comes to the specifics of the game, there's a lot of room for variation. Tetris has gone through remake after remake over the years, each one with slightly different rules and features. For example, some versions have a feature called soft drop, where you can speed up the piece falling, or hard drop, where you can instantly drop the piece. Some versions give different amounts of points for line clearing, or even have completely different rotation systems. So I decided to base all the features of my game on the NES version, which is the classic version of Tetris. That way I had a standard for how my game was going to work. As per usual, the first thing I built in Minecraft was the display. In my old game, the display was actually pretty small. Every tile was just 2x2 blocks, but the redstone behind it was much larger. Specifically, every tile took up a 4x6 area of space for the redstone before being condensed to 2x2 on the screen. Now, I've gotten a lot better at redstone over the years, so I was pretty confident that I could do the redstone in 4x4 this time instead of 4x6. And instead of doing this condensing thing, I felt like it would be better if the redstone and the screen both took up the same amount of space, 4x4 blocks per tile. So based on that, I knew that the redstone and the final screen would take up a space of 40 by 80 blocks. Then I started thinking about how I want the tiles to actually look. In my recent Pac-Man video, I put a redstone dot behind every tile and used a texture pack to add a new face to them. And since there are 16 signal strengths, I had 16 different textures to customize. So I wanted to use a similar approach for Tetris. I made one redstone dot for every tile again, and I started putting in some of the textures from the NES game. But I immediately ran into a problem. The max size for a texture face is 3x3 blocks. I don't know why, that's just how the Minecraft code works. So one redstone dot was not enough to fill up a 4x4 tile. I thought that maybe I could fill in the missing spaces with blocks, but I didn't like how that looked. So I decided to make each tile out of 4 copies of a 2x2 face. When you put in a signal strength value here, it gets duplicated to all 4 dots, and you get 4 copies of the texture. But of course, the downside to this is that now it's impossible to still look like the NES game. The top left section is different than the bottom right section, for example, which is impossible if your tile is made up of 4 copies. Technically, you could use 4 different textures for each of the 4 sections, but then you run out of signal strengths really fast. So I scrapped the NES textures and just made a flat color for each piece like this. It kinda sucks that the textures don't have any detail to them, but I still felt like this was the best option. Next, I wanted to start showing some pieces on a screen. At first, this seemed kind of complicated. Tetris pieces are not a single tile. They span multiple tiles and take up all kinds of different sizes. But then I realized something useful. Every piece is made up of exactly 4 tiles. So, with 4 matrix decoders, you can draw whatever piece you want. Each of these decoders takes an XY coordinate and tells that pixel to turn on. For example, if you put in 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, and 1, 4, that's the line piece. Or if you put in these coordinates, that's the square. But I also needed a way to tell the screen which color it is. Remember, the 7 colors are represented by signal strengths 1 through 7. So I made this circuit, which takes a 3-bit binary number and tells the screen to output that signal strength. For example, if I put in the number 4, then the piece comes out with signal strength 4, which according to the texture pack, is green. But of course, I didn't want to draw the pieces manually every time, so I made a ROM to store all 7 pieces. Now I could show any piece on the screen with just the flick of a lever. And as you can see, this worked perfectly. Next, I thought about how I'm going to rotate these pieces. Rotation is interesting, because like I said before, not every Tetris version does it the same way. But in the NES version, which again is my standard, this is how it works. There are 3 categories of pieces. Pieces that have 1 rotation state, 2 rotation states, and 4 rotation states. There's only one piece with 1 rotation state, the square. You can't rotate the square, so it always looks like this. Then there are 3 pieces that have 2 rotation states, the line piece, the Z piece, and the S piece. If you overlap the 2 states of the line piece, it looks like this. As it rotates, it just swaps between these states, regardless of whether it's a clockwise or counterclockwise rotation. The Z and S pieces are the same way. Their overlaps look like this. Again, they just swap between 2 states. And finally, these 3 pieces have 4 rotation states. The best way to describe how these pieces rotate is by centering them on a 3x3 grid and physically rotating that grid. Clockwise rotation turns the grid like this, and counterclockwise like this. This creates 4 distinct rotation states. Now that I understood rotation, I started to think about different ways that it could be done. I thought maybe I could use some kind of matrix multiplication, or maybe some system of skewing pixels like in this video from Matt Parker. But as I played around with those ideas, I felt like I was overcomplicating things. Eventually, I realized that the simplest and easiest solution was to just store more ROM. For example, here I have all 4 rotation states of the T piece. So if you activate this one, you get this state. Or if you activate this one, you get this state. Then I have this rotator circuit, which basically just moves a signal across these 4 lines. When I press this button, you can see that the signal goes from one line to the next, and even wraps around to the start. By connecting these together, you can now rotate through the lines of ROM, which makes it look like the piece is rotating on the screen. I felt like this was a really nice way to do it, because there's no matrix math or anything like that, it's just switching between states. One thing to note is that it only rotates in one direction, but for reasons I'll explain later, I actually thought that was a good thing. So I went ahead and added all the ROM states and a rotator circuit for every piece. The total ROM went from 7 lines to 19 lines, but that is a small price to pay for rotation. I also added a shulker box randomizer, which allowed me to generate a random piece. There are 7 shulker boxes in this dispenser, so whichever one the dispenser chooses, the corresponding piece is generated. So now I could generate a random piece and rotate it. Beautiful. Next, I wanted to start moving pieces around on the screen. In my old Tetris game, I used a 2D shift register to do this. There was a locked repeater for every tile, and I was able to shift the screen left, right, or down. However, I've realized since then that shift registers are kind of limiting. In my opinion, the better way to move something is to use coordinates. This is what I did in my Pac-Man video. Pac-Man had an XY coordinate, and to move him to the right, for example, I just added 1 to the X value. Tetris pieces are a little bit different because they take up 4 tiles instead of 1, but the idea is the same. To move a Tetris piece to the right, you can add 1 to all 4 X values. So I put in some adders, which allowed me to add a value to all the X's or all the Y's. Right now, the piece is still at the bottom left, but if I put a 5 here, that 5 gets added to all the X values, which moves the entire piece 5 over. And if I put a 7 here, it moves the entire piece 7 up. Then I made registers to store the X value and the Y value, as well as some buttons for left, right, and down. Pressing left subtracts 1 from X, pressing right adds 1 to X, and pressing down subtracts 1 from Y. I also added a reset button, which sets the position to the top middle of the screen, right where the pieces spawn in. Putting this all together, here's all the things that I could do now. I could generate a random piece, move it left, right, or down, rotate it, and set it back to the top. My next goal was to replace these ugly buttons and make a proper user interface, especially because in the old version, I literally just left it as a bunch of buttons and called it a day. So first, I added some pressure plates to move left and right. This made sense because it allows you to press A or D on your keyboard. Then to rotate, I thought about maybe adding another pressure plate in the front, but this felt weird. I didn't like having to walk backwards to get back onto left and right. So instead, I added a tripwire above the player to detect when the player jumps, and made that the rotate. I thought this was a pretty creative solution to the problem. Solving problems like this is not always easy, but one thing that makes it a lot easier is the sponsor of this video, Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. Every lesson is filled with hands-on activities, so it's way more fun and effective than just watching a lecture. By actually problem solving and not just memorizing, you won't just build knowledge, you'll become a better thinker. And if you're someone who's busy like me, Brilliant will help you build real knowledge with just a few minutes a day. The lessons are always available whenever you have time. One of my favorite courses right now is How LLMs Work, which lets you experience the mechanics of today's most advanced tools. You'll get hands-on with real language models as you explore how they build vocabulary, choose their next word, and more. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/mattbatwings or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Now that I could spawn a piece and do stuff to it, it was time to think about how this game will actually work. The biggest problem at this point was that I could only show one piece at a time, whereas in the real game, there could be tons of pieces on the screen. But the nice thing about Tetris is that there's only one piece that's falling at a time. So here was my plan. I wanted to separate the game into two main systems, the falling system and the permanent system. Both systems are combined before being shown to the player, so anything in the falling system shows up on the screen, and anything in the permanent system shows up on the screen too. When a new piece spawns, it starts at the top of the falling system, and as you might have guessed, it falls down. The player can move it or rotate it during this time too. When it hits the bottom, it can't move anymore. It's permanently in place unless there's a line clear. So the falling system detects that and sends it over to the permanent system. Then another piece spawns. It starts falling until it hits this piece in the permanent system. This gets detected, and it gets sent over again. And yeah, this repeats itself over and over again for every piece that falls. Notice that there's only one piece in the falling system at a time, which means that I could use everything I've built so far as the falling system. This entire circuit can be dedicated to just showing the falling piece. All I needed to build now was the permanent system. So I got to work doing just that. I put in a memory cell on every tile, which acted as the permanent system. When I press this button, it saves the falling piece to the cells. So now I could let the piece fall, and when it hits something, I could save it to the permanent system and generate a new piece. Then when this piece hits something, I could save it and generate again. Pretty cool, right? Next, I started working on collision detection. Right now, the falling piece has no idea about the walls or anything in the permanent system, so it'll literally just phase right through them. I needed to make a circuit to detect for a collision and stop the piece from clipping into things. Specifically, if any tile of the piece has something next to it on the left, the piece shouldn't be able to move left anymore. Same thing for the right, and same thing for down. So I thought the easiest way to do this was with a bunch of AND gates. For example, to detect a left collision, you can make an AND gate between every tile in the falling system and every tile to the left in the permanent system. If any of the AND gates are true, then you have a collision. And you can use this same idea for right and down. So I went ahead and built these AND gates. These orange circuits are the detection lines for left, right, and down. Now if I try to clip the piece into the wall, it stops me. Or if the piece lands on another piece, it stops automatically. This immediately made the game feel a lot more real, and I was super happy with it. But there was still a pretty big problem when it came to collision. You could clip into things by rotating. For example, if the line piece is against the wall and you rotate it, it completely clips in. I'll be honest, I knew about this problem for a while, and I had absolutely no idea how to solve it. You might think that you can just block rotations if it's against a wall, but that doesn't always work. If the line piece is against the wall, but it's sideways, a rotation is perfectly fine. So this seemed like a really complicated problem. I mean, how am I supposed to detect whether or not the player can rotate without seeing into the future? And then I realized that's the key. I need to look into the future. If I know ahead of time what the rotated piece looks like, I can compare it to what's on the screen and make sure it doesn't cause any problems. If there's an intersection, then just don't allow the piece to rotate. This is why I made one rotate button instead of two. Having one rotate button means that every piece only has one next rotated version. So I built another ROM to store all the rotated versions along with another 4 matrix decoders. So when the normal piece is coming out of here, the rotated version is simultaneously coming out of here. And if that rotated version has an intersection with anything, it gets detected here and it stops the player from rotating. This worked absolutely beautifully. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the actual NES implementation is similar because it felt pretty much identical. Next, it was time to tackle line clearing. This is a really important part of Tetris. After the falling piece gets locked into place, the game checks for any lines that are completely full and clears them, and the lines above them shift down. It's worth noting that the most lines you can clear at once is 4, and you have to use the line piece. This is called getting a Tetris. So my first idea for line clearing was to basically mimic gravity. If any line sees that it has a clear line below it, it could detect that and fall down. This technically works, but it's pretty slow. It creates a ripple effect as the clear line travels upwards. So then I came up with a better algorithm. First, find the lowest full line if there is one. Clear it and shift everything else above it down by 1. Repeat this 3 more times, and that's it. When I tried this out on paper, it worked perfectly. In fact, it doesn't even have to be the lowest full line. You can pick any line you want, as long as you do it 4 times. Building this in Minecraft was definitely a challenge. I went through iteration after iteration, trying to find the best way to implement it with Redstone. And eventually, I landed on a really elegant solution. The main idea is to just use a glass tower. Let's say you have a full line here and here. This is the lowest full line, so you're going to need to shift everything else above it down. And if you look at the output of the glass tower, that's exactly what it gives you. It tells you that you need to shift these 4 lines down. Then once you clear it, this is now the lowest line, and now the tower tells you that you need to shift these lines down. So that's what this giant glass tower is for. It tells the system exactly which lines to shift down. And now, if you press this button 4 times, it will always clear the lines. At this point, I had all the main functionality of Tetris. I could generate a random piece, move it around, rotate it, save it to the screen, and I could clear lines. The next step was to hook everything up to a clock and see if I could get a basic version of the game working. Usually when I make games, this part of the process isn't that difficult. I mean, Redstone clocks are not that complicated. But this time, there were some interesting questions I had to answer in order to make the game work properly. For example, what should happen if the piece wants to move sideways and down in the same frame? I was tempted to just allow both, but this caused some problems. Like in this scenario, there's no left collision and there's no down collision, but if you do both, the piece still clips into a block. So then I thought maybe I should give priority to one of them, but this causes problems too. If I give priority to sideways, then it's possible for the player to keep the piece floating by doing left, right forever. And if I give priority to down, then the player might feel annoyed that their button press didn't go through. After all, if you tell it to move left or right, it should move left or right. So my solution for this was to split the game into 2 clocks. One clock for downward movement and another clock for sideways movement and rotation. By alternating these 2 clocks, you can ensure that the piece never wants to do 2 things at the same time. So this is exactly what I did in Redstone. Every 100 redstone ticks, the game alternates between down and something from the player. When I tested this out, it felt perfect. And now I could basically play Tetris. The game wasn't completely done, but all the hardest parts definitely were. Next, I expanded the screen a little bit and added a next piece display. This is another big part of Tetris. Being able to see the next piece makes it a lot easier to plan out your stacking. Originally, the piece generation worked like this. When you generate a piece, it comes out right here. Nice and easy. In order to see what the next piece will be, I added a buffer. Now when you generate a piece, it puts it into the buffer and moves the buffer over to the output. This system is great because it still outputs a random piece every time. Except now I know what the next piece will be. It's right here. So yeah, I just built this buffer, and I built a little ROM to show the next piece on the screen. Finally, I added a scoring system. I started by stealing this counter circuit, and I retextured redstone lamps to be black and white so that it looks better on the screen. Then I looked up how many points you get for clearing lines, because I had no idea. According to this wiki, in NES Tetris, you get different amounts of points based on how many lines you clear and what level it is. I wasn't sure if I was going to make a level system yet, so for now, I just made the game add the points from level 0. 40 points for 1 line, all the way up to 1200 points for 4 lines. Then I scrolled down to see how many points you get for dropping a piece, and I had a mini heart attack. The points you get for a dropped piece are based on how many tiles you've soft dropped the piece for... Wait, soft drops? I completely forgot about those. There I was thinking I was almost done, and I hadn't implemented one of the main features of NES Tetris. A soft drop is when you press the down button and the piece falls faster. But as I thought about it more, I actually convinced myself that putting in soft drops was not a good idea. The max falling speed was already really slow, so if I made that the speed of a soft drop, then I would have to make the regular falling speed even slower. And for similar reasoning, I convinced myself that a level system wasn't a good idea either. To make the levels get faster, you would have to artificially slow the lower levels down. And what's the point of levels if they don't get faster or change colors? But anyways, I still wanted a drop piece to give something, so I just made it give 10 points every time. And with that, the scoring system was done. This was honestly one of my favorite projects I've ever made. It's a really great feeling to take an old project and upgrade it with all the skills I've learned these past few years. If you'd like to play it yourself, there's a world download and texture pack download in the description. I also included a fully lamp version which doesn't require a texture pack. I'll see you in the showcase.